He stood in silence before his father's coffin, never realizing that this goodbye would take his name with it. 3 days later, Caleb Stroud opened a letter in a small wooden box. Inside were things no one had ever explained. A military badge engraved with a name that wasn't his, a hand-drawn map leading deep into the Idaho mountains, a key that didn't seem to belong to any door he had ever known, and a life that didn't belong to the man who raised him. So he drove. Miles of empty road stretched ahead, his German shepherd Koda sitting beside him, quiet, watchful, as if he understood this wasn't just a journey, it was a crossing. The deeper Caleb went, the less the world made sense, until the road disappeared and the forest closed in around him. Then he found it. A house hidden in the mountains, not abandoned, not alive, just waiting. And the moment he stepped inside, something shifted, not in the walls, not in the silence, but in the man he thought he was. If this story moves you, let me know where you're watching from. Share your thoughts, hit like, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's keep spreading stories like this. Winter settled over Bozeman, Montana like a quiet decision no one had the strength to argue with. Snow didn't fall in dramatic bursts that day. It drifted slowly, steadily, coating rooftops, softening the edges of sidewalks, and swallowing sound until even footsteps felt distant. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the small town in a way that made everything feel contained, as if nothing beyond it really mattered. The air carried a dry, biting cold that slipped through fabric and settled deep in the bones, the kind of cold that didn't demand attention but never let you forget it was there. Caleb Stroud stood at the edge of that stillness, just outside the small chapel where the funeral was being held. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet control of a man who had spent years in places where hesitation could cost more than time. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a broad-shouldered frame that had not softened despite the years since he left the Navy SEALs. His movements were measured, economical, like he had trained himself to waste nothing, not energy, not words, not emotion. His dark brown hair was cut short, military clean, though faint strands of gray had begun to show at the temples. His eyes, a muted gray blue, rarely lingered on anything for too long, always scanning, always aware. He wore a red and black plaid flannel jacket over a dark shirt, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, paired with faded jeans and heavy boots dusted with snow. It wasn't an outfit chosen for the occasion. It was simply what he wore, what he had always worn. Beside him stood Koda, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat that caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky. The dog's posture was steady, balanced, his body aligned just slightly ahead of Caleb, as if he had already decided his role was to stand between the man and anything that might approach. One ear stood fully upright, while the other tipped just slightly at the edge, giving him an expression that felt more thoughtful than alert. Koda didn't pull at the leash. He didn't shift impatiently. He simply stood, watching the world with a calm intensity that mirrored Caleb's own. Inside the chapel, voices murmured in low, restrained tones. Caleb stepped in without hesitation, the warmth inside doing little to soften the cold that had settled into him long before the day began. The room was small, built of dark wood that carried the faint scent of polish and age. Rows of pews held scattered townspeople, neighbors, old acquaintances, men who had once worked alongside Harold Stroud but had drifted away over the years. No one spoke loudly. No one lingered in conversation. It was the kind of gathering that existed more out of respect than closeness. At the front of the room, the casket rested beneath a soft, filtered light. Harold Stroud lay inside, hands folded neatly across his chest, his face composed into a stillness that didn't quite match the man Caleb had known. Harold had never been a man of many words, but he had always carried a quiet presence, a sense of awareness that suggested he saw more than he said. Even in silence, there had been something behind his eyes, something active, something unresolved. Now there was nothing, just stillness. Caleb didn't move closer. He stood off to the side, close enough to see but far enough to avoid the weight of proximity. Koda settled beside him, lowering himself to the floor without command, his head lifting just enough to keep the room in view. His gaze moved occasionally, tracking subtle shifts, someone adjusting in their seat, a door opening slightly, the faint creak of wood. but he never strayed far from Caleb. A woman approached quietly from one of the pews. She was in her late 30s, with shoulder-length blonde hair pulled loosely back, strands escaping around her face. Her build was slender, her posture slightly tense, as if she carried more weight than her frame suggested. Her name was Tessa Stroud, Caleb's younger sister by adoption. She had grown up in the same house, under the same roof, but had always been different in ways that were hard to define. Where Caleb withdrew, Tessa confronted. Where he held things in, she spoke them out, sometimes too quickly, sometimes too sharply. Over the years, that difference had carved distance between them, not from lack of care, but from an inability to meet in the same place. "You came," she said softly, stopping a few feet away. Her voice held a quiet edge, not surprise, not quite relief. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." Tessa glanced toward the casket, then back at him. Her eyes lingered for a moment, searching for something, reaction, grief, anything that might confirm he felt what she did. When she didn't find it, she looked away. He would have wanted that. Caleb didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because he wasn't sure what Harold would have wanted. That had always been the problem. Harold had lived a life that felt complete from the outside, but incomplete in ways Caleb had never been able to name. The service passed without imprint. Words were spoken, about resilience, about hard work, about a life that had shaped more than it showed. Caleb heard them the way you hear a radio in another room, recognizable but distant. He stood through it all, unmoving, Koda rising only when Caleb shifted, staying close, aligned. Afterward, people approached in ones and twos, offering brief condolences, measured nods, quiet touches on the shoulder. Caleb acknowledged them all the same way, short, controlled, without invitation for more. Tessa stayed nearby, speaking when necessary, stepping in when silence stretched too long. It wasn't coordination, it was habit. As the room began to empty, a man approached from the far side of the chapel. He was older, late 60s, with thinning gray hair combed neatly back, and a posture that remained upright despite the weight of age. His name was Walter Hensley, a local attorney who had handled most of Harold's affairs over the years. His suit was dark and well-kept, his expression composed, but his eyes carried the careful attention of someone used to delivering information people didn't always want to hear. "Mr. Stroud," Walter said, his tone respectful but direct. "I was hoping to speak with you before you left." Caleb turned slightly, giving him his attention. "Now works." Walter nodded once, reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. He withdrew a small object wrapped in plain cloth along with an envelope. "Your father left specific instructions. This was to be given to you personally, not before today." Caleb's gaze dropped briefly to the items, then returned to Walter. "He say what it was?" Walter hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Only that it was important, and that you would understand its significance when the time came." Caleb took the envelope first. His name was written across the front in Harold's handwriting, tight, controlled, unmistakable. The same hand that had signed every document, every receipt, every note left on the kitchen table over the years. The wrapped object followed. It was heavier than it looked. Tessa stepped closer, her attention sharpening. "What is that?" Caleb didn't answer. He wasn't ignoring her, he just didn't have one. Walter inclined his head slightly. "I'll leave you to it," he said, stepping back without waiting for dismissal. "If you need anything further, you know how to reach me." When he was gone, the room felt quieter than before. Not empty, but stripped of whatever structure had held it together. Tessa looked at the items in Caleb's hands, her expression tightening. "You're going to open it here?" Caleb glanced around the near-empty chapel, then back at the envelope. "No." They didn't speak again until they were outside. The cold hit sharper this time, the air cutting through the lingering warmth of the building. Snow had begun to fall more steadily, covering the ground in a clean, uninterrupted layer. Caleb walked to his truck parked along the edge of the lot. Koda followed without needing direction, jumping up into the passenger seat as soon as the door opened. Tessa stopped a few steps away, arms folded tightly against the cold. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Whatever that is, whatever he left, you don't have to go looking for something that might not matter." Caleb rested one hand on the truck door, the other still holding the envelope and the wrapped object. If he wanted it buried, he would have buried it. Tessa shook her head slightly, frustration flickering beneath the surface. Or maybe he didn't want you to carry it. Caleb met her gaze for a brief moment. Too late for that. He got into the truck without another word, closing the door with a solid, final sound. The engine turned over, low and steady. For a moment, he didn't move. The envelope rested on the seat beside him. The wrapped object lay across his lap. Koda sat still, his gaze forward, ears angled slightly as if listening to something beyond the immediate. Caleb exhaled slowly, then reached for the cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small, wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age. No markings, no labels, just a simple latch at the front. He opened it. Inside, arranged with deliberate care, lay 3 objects: a military badge, a folded map, and a key. Caleb picked up the badge first. The metal was cold, the engraving worn but still clear. Elias Mercer. The name settled into the space around him like something that had always been there, waiting. Caleb didn't move for a long moment. Then he set the badge back into the box, closed the lid, and stared out through the windshield at the falling snow. For the first time in his life, the name Stroud didn't feel like the only one he carried. Morning came to Bozeman without light. The sky did not open or shift in color. It remained a flat, unmoving gray, pressing low over the town as if the night had never fully ended. Snow had stopped falling, but the cold lingered, settled deep into the streets, into the buildings, into the quiet spaces between things. The air felt still, almost suspended, the kind of stillness that made movement seem louder than it should have been. Caleb Stroud stood in the small kitchen of his father's house, the wooden floor cool beneath his boots, the heater clicking intermittently somewhere behind the walls. The house had not changed. The cabinets were still slightly misaligned, the countertop worn smooth in the places Harold had used most often. The chair near the window pulled back just enough to suggest someone had stood up and never returned. But something in it felt different now. Not empty, not unfamiliar, just altered, as if the meaning of everything inside had shifted overnight. The wooden box sat on the table in front of him, closed, unmoved since he had brought it in the night before. Beside it lay the folded map, the key, and the badge with the name Elias Mercer. Caleb had not touched them again, not because he was avoiding it, because he did not yet know what touching them again would mean. Koda lay near the doorway, his body angled toward Caleb, his head resting low but not fully relaxed. His ears shifted occasionally, catching small sounds the house made as it settled. He had not slept deeply, not once since they had returned. Caleb picked up the map. The paper resisted slightly as he unfolded it, creases worn deep from repeated use. The lines drawn across it were not clean or precise. They were deliberate, marked by someone who had not needed clarity for anyone else. A route traced from Montana into Idaho, then further into the mountains where roads thinned and names disappeared. A single area circled in dark ink, not labeled, not explained. Caleb studied it longer this time, not searching for direction, trying to understand intention. Behind him, the sound of the front door opening broke the stillness. It was not loud, but it did not belong. Caleb turned slightly, his posture shifting without urgency, controlled. Tessa stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat as she closed the door behind her. She looked different in daylight. The strain from the day before had settled into something quieter, something more resolved. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly this time, no loose strands, no distraction. Her frame still carried that slight tension, but her posture was straighter, more deliberate. She had decided something. "You didn't leave," she said, her voice steady, not questioning. "Not yet," Caleb replied, setting the map down. Her eyes moved immediately to the table, to the objects laid out. She didn't step closer right away. She stood where she was, taking it in, measuring something she hadn't fully allowed herself to acknowledge before. "That name," she said after a moment. "You've been saying it?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. Then, "Once." Tessa exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping briefly before returning to him. "I asked him once," she said. "Years ago. About before Montana. About before us." He didn't answer. Not really. She stepped closer now, stopping at the edge of the table. "I thought it was just something he didn't want to talk about." Caleb watched her. "Maybe it was." Tessa shook her head faintly. "No, this feels different." She reached out, not touching the objects, just hovering above them. "This feels like something he didn't want you to know." Caleb leaned back slightly against the counter, arms folding loosely. Then he shouldn't have left it. That's not how he worked, Tessa said, sharper now. You know that. He didn't leave things open unless he had to. Silence settled between them, not heavy, but present. Caleb looked back at the map. He left a direction. Tessa's gaze followed his. And you're going to follow it. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded once. Yeah. Tessa turned away slightly, pacing once across the small kitchen before stopping near the window. Outside, the world remained unchanged, gray and still. You don't know what's out there, she said. You don't know who that man was, what he did. Caleb's voice stayed even. That's the point. Tessa looked back at him, frustration rising beneath the surface. No. The point is, you've spent your whole life building something that works. Maybe not perfect, but stable. And now you're ready to throw it out because of a name on a piece of metal? Caleb didn't react immediately. When he spoke, his tone didn't shift. It's not the name. Tessa held his gaze. Then what is it? Caleb paused, not searching for an answer, weighing whether to give one. It's that it was hidden. The words landed differently, not louder, just clearer. Tessa's expression changed, not softened, but less certain. She didn't respond. Koda lifted his head slightly, his attention shifting toward the window, then toward the front of the house. His body didn't tense, it aligned. Subtle, controlled, but deliberate. Caleb noticed. What is it? He said quietly. Koda stood, moving toward the door in a slow, measured line. He didn't bark, didn't pace. He stopped just inside the entryway, ears angled forward, head slightly lowered. Tessa followed his movement with her eyes. What's he doing? Caleb didn't answer. He moved past her, stepping toward the door, his hand hovering near the handle before opening it. Cold air pushed in immediately, sharper than before. Across the street, a car sat idling. It wasn't out of place enough to draw attention on its own. A dark sedan, older model, dusted lightly with snow. But it had been there long enough to gather it, and it hadn't moved. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his boots pressing into the packed snow. He didn't approach. He didn't call out. He just stood, watching. The car didn't respond. A moment passed, then another. Inside the vehicle, a figure shifted, not enough to reveal identity, just enough to confirm presence. Caleb's posture didn't change. Behind him, Tessa stepped into the doorway, pulling her coat tighter around her. Do you know them? No, Caleb said. Then why are they? The engine cut. The car door opened. A man stepped out. He was in his mid-40s, maybe older, with a build that suggested strength not maintained through training, but through habit. His coat was dark, unremarkable, worn at the edges but clean. His hair was short, dark with hints of gray. His face lined in a way that didn't come from age alone. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, controlled but not rigid, like someone who had spent years observing before acting. His name, though Caleb did not yet know it, was Daniel Rourke. He didn't approach immediately. He stood by the car, studying the house, then Caleb, then the dog. His eyes lingered on Koda for a moment longer than necessary. Didn't mean to make it look like I was watching, the man said finally, his voice calm, even. Just needed to be sure. Caleb didn't respond to the explanation. Sure of what? The man took a few steps forward, stopping well short of the porch. Not close enough to threaten, not far enough to disengage. That you were still here. Tessa shifted behind Caleb, her presence tightening. And why would that matter? Caleb asked. The man's gaze flicked briefly toward her, then back. Because if you weren't, he said, I wouldn't have come up. Caleb held his gaze. You got a name? Rourke, the man said. Daniel Rourke. Caleb didn't offer his. Rourke nodded slightly, as if he didn't expect one. I worked with a man once, he continued. Went by Mercer. The name settled into the cold air between them. Tessa inhaled sharply behind Caleb, but didn't speak. Caleb's expression didn't change. A lot of people did. Rourke's mouth tightened just slightly. Not like I did. Silence followed. Koda remained still, his attention fixed, not aggressive, not relaxed. Watching. Rourke glanced at the dog again. He knows, he said quietly. Caleb didn't ask what that meant. Instead, why are you here? Rourke exhaled once, slow. Because if you've got that name, he said. "You've got something else, too." Caleb didn't move, didn't respond. Rourke studied him for another moment, then nodded to himself. "You're going to go looking," he said. "I can see that." Tessa stepped forward now, her voice sharp. "He's not going anywhere." Caleb didn't look back at her. Rourke's gaze shifted again, measuring her this time. "You don't get to decide that," he said, not unkindly, just certain. Tessa's jaw tightened. Caleb spoke before she could respond. "If you've got something to say, say it." Rourke nodded once. "Idaho," he said. "That's where it leads." Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, just enough to register. Rourke noticed. "Thought so." "You've been there," Caleb said. Rourke shook his head. "No, but I know what he was doing before he disappeared." A pause. "And I know he didn't leave things unfinished." The implication lingered. Caleb didn't ask for more. Rourke stepped back slightly, creating distance without breaking connection. "You go out there," he said. "You're not just looking for answers." Caleb's voice remained steady. "Then what am I doing?" Rourke held his gaze. "You're stepping into something that didn't end." The words didn't carry threat, they carried weight. A long silence followed. Then Rourke turned, walking back toward his car without waiting for a response. He paused at the door, glancing back once. "If you're smart," he said, "you won't go." He got in. The engine started. The car pulled away slowly, disappearing down the street without urgency. The quiet returned. Tessa stepped forward beside Caleb, her voice low now. "You see," she said. "This is exactly what I meant." Caleb watched the empty road for a moment longer. Then he turned, walking back inside without responding. Koda followed immediately. Inside, the house felt smaller again. Caleb moved to the table, picking up the map, folding it carefully along its worn lines. He slipped the key into his pocket. The badge followed. Tessa watched him, her expression tightening. "You're really going to do this?" Caleb pulled on his jacket, the familiar weight settling over his shoulders. "Yeah." Tessa shook her head, stepping back. "Then don't expect me to be okay with it." Caleb paused at the door, just for a moment. "I don't." He opened it. The cold air met him again. Koda stepped out first, not looking back. Caleb followed. Behind him, the house remained as it had been, but the direction had changed. The road out of Bozeman did not feel like a departure. It felt like a slow release, as if the town had never intended to hold Caleb Stroud in the first place. Morning remained gray, the sky stretching flat and unbroken over miles of quiet highway. Snow lay in uneven patches across the asphalt, pressed down by earlier traffic and hardened by the cold. The mountains ahead rose gradually, their outlines softened by distance, waiting without invitation or warning. Caleb drove without music. The radio worked, he had tested it once, letting static settle into a faint signal before turning it off again. Silence suited the road, or maybe it suited him. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, steady, controlled. The folded map lay on the seat beside him, the edges worn from use that wasn't his. The key sat in his jacket pocket, heavier than it should have been. The badge with the name Elias Mercer rested in the center console, within reach but out of sight. Koda sat upright in the passenger seat, his posture balanced, his front paws planted firmly as the truck moved beneath him. His gaze stayed forward most of the time, tracking the road, the horizon, the shifting lines of trees and fences. Every so often, his attention shifted, briefly, deliberately, as if selecting what mattered. He was not restless, he was attentive. Miles passed in a steady rhythm. The farther Caleb drove, the less the world asked of him. Towns became smaller, then fewer. Gas stations appeared at longer intervals, their signs flickering even in daylight. At one such stop, just beyond a place marked only by a single intersection and a closed diner, Caleb pulled in. The station was quiet, no other cars, no movement behind the windows. Caleb stepped out, boots pressing into the packed snow near the pump. The air felt colder here, sharper, as if the distance from the town had stripped away something protective. Koda jumped down beside him, landing softly, his head lifting slightly as he tested the air. Inside, the bell above the door rang once as Caleb entered. The interior was dim, lit by overhead lights that hummed faintly. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 50s, tall and lean, her dark hair pulled into a low, practical tie. Her face carried the kind of lines that came from years of routine rather than age, her expression neutral but not unfriendly. Her name tag read Marin Caldwell. She glanced up, her eyes taking in Caleb in a single practice sweep. "Passing through," she said, not asking. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." Her gaze shifted briefly toward the window, toward the truck, then back to him. "Road gets thin past the next ridge," she said. "Not many reasons to go that way this time of year." Caleb set a bottle of water on the counter. "Got one." Marin studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "Most people who say that don't mean it," she said. "You do." Caleb didn't respond. She rang up the purchase, her movements efficient, precise. "If you keep heading southwest," she added, "you'll lose cell service within the hour. After that, it's just you and whatever you think you're looking for." Caleb took the bottle. "That's enough." Marin gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Usually is." Outside, Koda had moved a short distance from the truck, not wandering, just circling once, then stopping near the edge of the lot. His body angled toward the road, ears slightly forward. Caleb followed his line of sight. The highway behind them stretched empty, but not entirely. A vehicle appeared at the far bend, small at first, then clearer as it approached. Dark-colored, moving at a steady pace. Caleb watched it without expression. Koda returned to his side without being called. The car passed without slowing. No turn, no signal, just continued on. Caleb didn't move until it disappeared. Then he got back into the truck. They drove on. The road narrowed as they crossed into Idaho, though the change was not marked by anything dramatic. A sign, half covered in snow, stood at the side of the highway, its lettering faded. Caleb passed it without slowing. The landscape shifted gradually. Trees grew closer together. The terrain rose unevenly, the road bending more often, less predictable. He checked the map once, then again. The marked path became less precise the farther they went. Lines that had once followed clear routes now diverged into something less defined. A turn that didn't appear on any sign. A road that looked more like an opening between trees than an actual path. Caleb took it. The truck moved slower now, tires pressing through fresh layers of snow that had not yet been disturbed. Branches leaned inward, narrowing the space, forcing attention. The world tightened around them. Koda's posture shifted, not tense, focused. They drove until the road stopped. Not abruptly, it simply ceased to be a road. The tracks faded. The space ahead narrowed into something that could not be followed by vehicle. Caleb cut the engine. Silence settled in. He sat for a moment, hands resting lightly on the wheel, eyes tracing the path ahead. This was where most people would turn back. No confirmation, no assurance, just direction without validation. Koda didn't wait. He jumped down from the truck, landing softly in the snow, then turned back, standing a few steps ahead, watching Caleb. Caleb stepped out. The cold hit differently here. Cleaner, sharper. It didn't settle on the surface, it moved through. He reached into his jacket, touching the folded map, not pulling it out. He didn't need it now. The path ahead led into the trees. They moved forward. Each step pressed into the snow with a quiet certainty. The forest closed around them, branches thick, the light dimmed further by the density above. Sound disappeared quickly here. No wind, no distant movement, just the faint rhythm of boots and paws. Koda walked slightly ahead, his pace controlled, his head lifting occasionally as he tested the air. He did not hesitate. He did not rush. He moved with recognition, not of the place itself, but of places like it. The trees began to thin, and then it was there. The house. It did not appear suddenly. It revealed itself. A structure set into the slope of the mountain, half anchored against rock, the other half extending outward in dark timber that had weathered but not broken. Snow rested along the roofline in uneven layers. The windows reflected the gray sky, giving nothing back. Caleb stopped. Koda didn't. He walked forward slowly, approaching the structure without hesitation, his posture steady, his attention focused. He circled once, then returned, standing near the front door. Caleb followed. Up close, the details became clearer. The wood was aged but not neglected. The door was solid, reinforced, without visible lock or handle beyond a simple grip. No footprints marked the snow around it. No sign of recent movement, but it did not feel abandoned. Caleb reached into his pocket, pulling out the key. He studied it briefly, then looked at the door. There was no keyhole. He paused. Koda stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Caleb's leg, grounding the moment. Caleb placed his hand on the door. Cold, but not empty. He pushed. The door opened. Inside, the air was still, but not stale. The room was simple, sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against one wall. Everything arranged with purpose, not comfort. There was no dust thick enough to suggest years of neglect. No decay. No signs of intrusion. Caleb stepped in slowly. Koda followed, pausing just inside the threshold, his ears shifting slightly as he listened to something deeper than sound. Caleb moved further into the room, his eyes scanning, not searching for objects but for meaning. The place held itself the way the man who built it must have. Controlled, intentional, without excess. Koda stopped. Not in the center. Not near anything obvious. He stood still. Caleb turned toward him. The dog's body was not tense. It was fixed. His gaze directed toward one section of the wall, where a wooden panel blended seamlessly with the rest of the structure. Caleb followed that gaze. He stepped closer, running his fingers along the edge of the panel. The difference was subtle. Too precise. Too clean. He pressed. Nothing. He shifted his weight, pressing again, this time slightly lower. A faint click. The panel moved. Not like a door, like something designed not to be found. It opened just enough to reveal darkness behind it. Cold air drifted out. Koda stepped forward, peering into the space, then looked back at Caleb. Caleb didn't hesitate. He reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt, switched it on, and directed the beam downward. Stairs. Descending. Not improvised. Built. Deliberate. Caleb exhaled slowly. Not surprise. Recognition settling in. He looked once more at the room above, then stepped down. The air changed the moment Caleb Stroud stepped below the threshold. It wasn't colder in the way the mountain air above had been. It was contained, controlled, stripped of movement. The kind of air that belonged to a space that had been sealed with intention rather than abandoned by time. The beam of his flashlight cut a narrow path down the staircase, catching the edges of each step as they descended into darkness. The structure did not creak. It did not shift. Every surface absorbed sound instead of returning it. Koda followed close behind, his presence steady, his paws making almost no noise against the steps. His posture remained aligned, not cautious, not relaxed, focused. His head moved slightly as they descended, tracking something Caleb could not hear. At the base of the stairs, the space opened. The lights came on without warning. Not harsh, not sudden. A low, controlled glow spread across the room, revealing a structure that had not been improvised, but built. The walls were reinforced, lined with panels designed to reduce echo. The air carried a faint mechanical hum, subtle enough to ignore, but persistent enough to confirm that something in this place still functioned. Caleb lowered the flashlight but did not turn it off. The room stretched wider than the house above suggested. Tables were arranged with precision. Equipment sat in place, not new but not outdated enough to be dismissed. Recording devices, storage units, sealed containers. Everything labeled, everything positioned, nothing explained. Caleb moved forward slowly, his eyes scanning across the surfaces, not searching for anything specific, but absorbing everything. His training had taught him to read spaces the way others read language. This was not a place someone had fled from. It was a place someone had prepared. Koda moved along the perimeter, his steps measured, his head lowering occasionally as he passed certain points, then lifting again. He was mapping the room in his own way, marking what mattered, what didn't. He did not bark. He did not signal alarm. He simply observed. Caleb reached the nearest table and opened one of the folders laid across it. The paper inside was thick, worn slightly at the edges from handling, not from age alone. The first page contained coordinates, not printed, written. The handwriting was deliberate, controlled, consistent. He turned the page. Timelines, unit identifiers, fragments of reports. No summaries, no conclusions, just pieces. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly as he moved through them. The details did not align cleanly. One document described a strike executed under direct orders. Another described hesitation. A third referenced incomplete intelligence. The same event, fractured into separate perspectives. He set the folder down and moved to the next. This one was thinner, a different kind of record. Personal notes. The handwriting matched the map. The same pressure, the same precision. Elias Mercer. Caleb did not say the name out loud this time. He read. We were given a target without confirmation. The line was written without emphasis, without justification. He turned the page. I asked for clarity. I was told to proceed. Another line. I delayed. Caleb's fingers rested against the edge of the paper, unmoving. He turned again. 6 minutes. The number stood alone on the page, no explanation attached to it. Caleb exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured. He set the folder aside. Across the room, Koda stopped. Not at the wall, not near the stairs. Near a second table, different from the others, cleaner, less used. Caleb moved toward him. The table held a single object, a recording unit. A headset rested beside it, positioned exactly where someone would sit, not carelessly placed, set with intention, waiting. Caleb stopped a few steps away. Koda looked at him, then back at the device. Not urging, not warning, acknowledging. Caleb stepped forward. His hand hovered briefly over the headset before closing around it. The weight felt familiar. Not identical to anything he had used before, but close enough to carry the same imprint. He lifted it slowly and placed it over his ears. The room remained silent for a moment. Then the audio clicked. No static, no delay. Just breath. A man's breath. Measured. Controlled. Then a voice. Low. Even. Unhurried. If you're hearing this, the voice said, then I didn't find a way to explain it where it mattered. Caleb did not move. Koda's ears shifted slightly, but he stayed where he was. I was given a directive, the voice continued. Not a suggestion. Not a decision I was meant to make. A directive. A pause followed. Not for effect, for precision. I delayed execution by 6 minutes. Caleb's grip on the edge of the table tightened, just enough to register. 6 minutes is not enough time to change an outcome, the voice said. But it's enough time to make people believe you could have. The words did not defend themselves. They did not ask for understanding. They existed. I believed the intelligence was incomplete, the voice continued. I still believe that. Another pause. I asked for confirmation. I did not receive it. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Not to block the sound, to hold it steady. When the strike went through, the voice said, we lost 3. Silence followed. Not empty, contained. No confirmed hostiles. Caleb's breathing remained even, but something in his posture shifted. Not visibly, internally. I don't know if waiting caused that, the voice said after a moment. I know it didn't stop it. The recording ended. No closing statement, no conclusion, just absence. Caleb removed the headset slowly, placing it back on the table with the same precision it had been left with. The room did not change. Koda stepped closer this time, stopping just beside him, his body aligned, his presence steady. He did not look at the device. He looked at Caleb. Caleb exhaled. Not clean, he said quietly. Koda's tail moved once. Caleb glanced around the room again, this time seeing it differently. Not as a collection of objects, as a structure built to hold something unresolved. Not to fix it, not to justify it, to preserve it. He moved back to the folders, opening another. More reports, different names, different handwriting, same event, different truths, none of them complete. Across the pages, one thing remained consistent. No one agreed on what had happened, and no one had been able to prove otherwise. Caleb closed the folder and stepped back. Above him, the house waited, silent, unchanged. Below, this place held something that had never been resolved. Koda turned toward the stairs, then back again, his gaze steady. Caleb followed that look. Yeah, he said under his breath. He took one last look at the recording unit, then turned. The climb back up felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, because the direction had. At the top, the cold air from the house met him again, carrying the faint scent of wood and snow. The space above felt smaller now, not empty, but incomplete in a way it hadn't before. Caleb stepped outside. The sky had shifted slightly, the gray lifting just enough to reveal the faint outline of the mountains beyond the trees. The light had not brightened, it had clarified. Koda moved ahead of him, stopping at the edge of the clearing. Caleb followed. For a moment, nothing moved. Then he saw it. At the far edge of the tree line, a figure, standing still, watching. Not close enough to engage, not far enough to ignore. Caleb didn't reach for anything, didn't call out. He just stood. Koda's posture changed. Not aggressive, focused. The figure stepped forward. A man, mid-50s, lean build, worn denim jacket lined at the collar. His movements were controlled, but not rigid, like someone who had learned to carry weight without showing it. His hair was cut short, uneven at the edges, streaked with gray. His face carried the quiet lines of someone who had spent more time remembering than forgetting. He stopped at a distance that didn't assume familiarity. "You found it," the man said. His voice was steady, not surprised. Caleb held his gaze. "Looks that way." The man nodded once, his eyes shifting briefly to Koda, then back. "Name's Grant Holloway." Caleb didn't move. Grant studied him for a moment longer. "You look like him," he said. Caleb didn't ask which one. The cold outside felt sharper after the controlled stillness below. It carried movement again, faint currents of wind slipping through the trees, brushing against the surface of the snow and shifting it in thin, uneven lines. The sky remained gray, but not as heavy as before. Something in it had lifted, just enough to make distance visible. Caleb Stroud stood at the edge of the clearing, facing the man who had stepped out from the tree line. Grant Holloway did not move closer immediately. He held his position, measuring the space between them as if distance itself carried meaning. His posture was relaxed in a way that wasn't careless, shoulders slightly forward, weight balanced, hands loose at his sides. A man who knew how to stand without appearing ready, even when he was. Koda stood just ahead of Caleb, his body aligned but not blocking, his attention fixed. His ears angled forward, then shifted slightly, catching the smallest changes in tone, in movement, in breath. Grant's gaze lingered on the dog for a moment before returning to Caleb. "Good animal," he said. "Not reactive, that's rare." Caleb didn't respond to the observation. "You said I look like him." Grant gave a faint nod. "Not exactly, but enough." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, in recognition. "It's in the way you hold still." Caleb's expression didn't change. "You knew Mercer." Grant let out a slow breath, the air visible in the cold. "Yeah," a pause. Long enough to know he wasn't simple. Silence settled briefly between them, not uncomfortable, measured. Caleb spoke again. "You followed me." Grant shook his head once. "No." He tilted his head slightly toward the house behind Caleb. "I followed the place." Another pause. "People don't find this by accident. When someone does, it gets noticed." Caleb glanced briefly over his shoulder toward the structure, then back. "By who?" Grant's mouth tightened slightly, not quite a smile. "By the ones who remember." The answer didn't explain anything. It didn't need to. Caleb stepped forward half a pace. "Then you've been here before." Grant's eyes flicked toward the house again, then back to Caleb. "Close," he said. "Never inside." Koda shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing Caleb's leg, grounding the moment without interrupting it. Caleb watched Grant carefully. "Why not?" Grant's gaze held steady. "Because it wasn't mine to enter." The statement landed with a quiet finality. Not defensive, not uncertain. Caleb considered that, then said, "It is now." Grant studied him for a moment longer, something in his expression settling into place. "Seems like it." The wind moved faintly through the trees, carrying a dry whisper across the clearing. Neither man turned toward it. Caleb's voice remained even. "You were on that mission." Grant didn't react immediately. Then, "Yeah." Caleb held his gaze. 3 didn't come back. Grant's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible shift in his composure. Not anger, not grief exactly, something more contained. "That's what you heard." "That's what he said," Caleb replied. Grant let out a short breath, almost a quiet exhale of acknowledgement. "That sounds like him." He looked down briefly, then back up. "Did he tell you the rest?" Caleb didn't answer. Grant nodded faintly. No, of course he didn't. The silence that followed was heavier this time. Not empty, filled with something unresolved. Caleb spoke again. Then tell me. Grant shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate. There's not a clean version, he said. You already know that. Say it anyway. Grant looked past Caleb for a moment, toward the slope of the mountain, then back again. We were sent in on bad information, he said. That part's true. A pause. We knew it didn't feel right. Some of us said it out loud, some didn't. His voice remained steady, but there was a roughness beneath it now. Something worn from repetition rather than emotion. Mercer asked for confirmation, Grant continued. Didn't get it. Command told us to proceed. Another pause. Standard. Caleb's posture didn't shift. And he delayed. Grant nodded once. Yeah. 6 minutes. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise, in recognition of the detail. That's right. Caleb waited. Grant looked down briefly, then back up, his expression unchanged, but his tone lower. What you don't hear in those recordings is what happens when you hesitate in a place like that. He let the words sit for a moment. 6 minutes is enough time for things to move, for people to reposition, for whatever you thought you understood to stop being true. The mountain air remained still around them. When the order went through, Grant said, it didn't hit what we thought it would. A longer pause. It hit something else. Caleb's voice was quiet. Civilians. Grant didn't answer directly. His silence did it for him. And the 3, Caleb said. Grant exhaled slowly. They were ours. His gaze held steady now. They were repositioning, trying to adjust to the delay, trying to make sense of what wasn't making sense. The words didn't rise. They didn't break. They got caught in it, Grant finished. Caleb didn't move. The weight of it settled without impact, just presence. Grant watched him carefully. You think that makes it simple, he said. It doesn't. Caleb's voice remained even. I didn't say it did. Grant's expression shifted slightly, something in it tightening, then releasing. Good. A long silence followed, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Koda moved then, stepping forward just enough to stand between them, not blocking, not asserting, simply present. His gaze moved from Grant to Caleb, then back again, measuring something neither man spoke aloud. Grant glanced down at the dog, then back up. He's reading it right, he said quietly. Caleb didn't ask what that meant. Instead, you said it didn't end. Grant nodded once, because it didn't. He shifted his stance slightly, turning just enough to glance toward the house again. That place up there, he said, that wasn't built to hide what happened. Caleb followed his gaze. It was built after, Grant continued, after everything fell apart. A pause. Mercer didn't disappear. He stepped out. Into this, Caleb said. Grant nodded. Into this. Caleb's eyes moved back to him. Why? Grant let out a quiet breath. Because there wasn't anywhere else to go. He tilted his head slightly, considering his own words. Not for someone like him. The statement held more than explanation. It carried something else, something closer to understanding. Caleb's voice remained steady. And you? Grant gave a faint shake of his head. I didn't step out. A brief pause. I stayed where I was supposed to. The words didn't sound like certainty. They sounded like something repeated often enough to hold shape. Caleb studied him. And that worked. Grant's mouth tightened slightly. Depends on what you think working looks like. Silence settled again. The sky above shifted faintly, the gray thinning just enough to let a colder light through. The edges of the mountains sharpened in the distance, their outlines clearer, more defined. Grant stepped back half a pace, not retreating, creating space. You're going to stay, he said. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the house, then back at Grant. Yeah. Grant nodded once, as if the answer confirmed something he had already expected. "Then you'll start to see it," he said. "See what?" Grant's gaze held steady. "Why he built it." Caleb didn't respond. Grant turned slightly, angling his body toward the tree line. "I'll come back," he said, "if you're still here." Not a question, not quite an offer. Then he stopped, glancing back once more. "Just remember," he added, "whatever version of him you're trying to understand." A pause. "You're going to have to live with it." The words lingered. Grant turned and walked back toward the trees, his steps steady, unhurried. He didn't look back again. The forest took him without sound. Caleb stood where he was for a moment longer, the cold settling in again, sharper now, more defined. Koda remained beside him, his posture steady, his presence unchanged. Caleb exhaled slowly. Then he turned back toward the house. This time, the door didn't feel like an entrance. It felt like a decision. Morning did not arrive with light, only with a thinning of darkness. The sky above the mountain shifted from deep gray to something flatter, less defined, as if the day had decided to exist without fully committing to it. The cold lingered in the clearing, settled into the ground and the wood of the house, into the quiet spaces between breaths. Nothing moved unless it needed to. Caleb Stroud stood just outside the doorway, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes fixed on the line where the trees began. Snow had hardened overnight, forming a thin crust that cracked softly under pressure. The air carried a faint edge of wind now, subtle, steady, not enough to disturb the branches, but enough to remind him the world beyond the clearing was still moving. Koda stood a few feet ahead, his posture balanced, his gaze shifting between the forest and Caleb. He had not wandered far since the night before. He had not relaxed either. His presence remained constant, not tense, not idle. Waiting. Caleb exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air. Behind him, the house held its silence. Not empty, not full, contained. The sound of tires broke that stillness. Faint at first, distant, then clearer as it approached along the narrow path that had no reason to carry vehicles. Caleb didn't turn immediately. He let the sound settle into recognition before shifting his stance slightly, his weight adjusting without tension. Koda reacted first. His ears angled forward, his body aligning, not aggressive, not relaxed, focused. The vehicle came into view through the trees. A compact SUV, light gray, cleaner than anything that belonged this far into the mountains. It moved carefully, not uncertain, but aware of where it did not belong. The engine cut before it fully reached the clearing. The driver's door opened. Tessa Stroud stepped out. She looked smaller here than she had in Bozeman, not physically, but in the way the mountain stripped things down to what they were. Her blonde hair was pulled back again, tighter than before. Her coat heavier, practical, chosen for the cold rather than appearance. Her posture carried the same tension Caleb knew, but it had shifted, less reactive, more deliberate. She closed the door and stood there for a moment, taking in the space, the house, Caleb, Koda. "You didn't make it easy to find," she said. Caleb's voice remained even. Wasn't supposed to be. Tessa nodded once, as if she had expected that answer. She stepped forward, her boots breaking through the crusted snow with quiet, uneven sounds. Koda watched her approach, his gaze steady, his body unmoving. When she came close enough, he shifted slightly, not blocking, not greeting, acknowledging. Tessa stopped a few steps away from Caleb. Her eyes moved briefly over him, checking something she didn't say out loud. "You stayed," she said. "Yeah." She glanced toward the house, then back. "I figured." A pause settled between them, not awkward, measured. "I met someone," Caleb said. Tessa's expression tightened slightly. "The man from before?" Caleb nodded. "Grant Holloway." Tessa exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping for a moment before returning. "I looked him up," she said, "after yesterday." A faint hesitation. "There's not much. Records are incomplete." Caleb didn't react. "That fits." Tessa studied him for a second longer. "And you trust him?" "No." The answer came without delay. Tessa's brow lifted slightly. "But you're listening." Caleb didn't respond. That was enough. Tessa turned, walking a slow circle across the clearing, her eyes moving over the structure, the edges of the house, the line where it met the rock behind it. She wasn't looking for flaws, she was assessing presence. "This place," she said quietly, "it doesn't feel abandoned." "It's not," Caleb replied. Tessa stopped, facing him again. Then what is it? Caleb's gaze shifted briefly toward the door, still figuring that out. The sound of movement came from the tree line. Not loud, not hidden either. Both of them turned. A second figure stepped into view, Grant Holloway. He moved the same way he had before, controlled, unhurried, as if the timing of his arrival had been decided long before he reached the clearing. His denim jacket carried the same wear, the same quiet signs of use. His face held no surprise at seeing Tessa, only acknowledgement. "You brought company," he said to Caleb. Tessa stepped slightly forward, her posture tightening just enough to register. "I came on my own." Grant's gaze shifted to her, measuring, not dismissive, not welcoming. "You're his sister." "Something like that," Tessa replied. Grant nodded once, accepting the answer without questioning it further. "You shouldn't be here." Tessa's expression didn't change. "Neither should you." A faint shift passed through Grant's posture, something almost like approval, but not quite. "Fair." Koda stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between the three of them. Not blocking, not choosing a side, just marking the space. Grant glanced down at the dog, then back up. "He's doing the same thing you are," he said to Caleb, holding the line. Caleb didn't respond. Tessa looked between them, tension rising again. "I didn't come here for this," she said. "I came because you're about to make a decision you can't walk back from." Caleb's voice remained steady. "Already made it." Tessa shook her head. "No, you think you have." She gestured toward the house. "This isn't just a place, it's a weight. Whatever he left here, it's not going to stay contained." Grant's eyes shifted briefly toward her, then back to Caleb. "She's not wrong." Tessa glanced at him, surprised by the agreement. Caleb looked at both of them, then back at the house. "It's already not contained." Silence followed. The wind moved faintly again, carrying a colder edge through the clearing. Tessa's voice softened slightly. "Then leave it," she said. "You don't owe him anything." Caleb didn't answer immediately. Grant did. "You don't," he said. A pause. "But that doesn't mean you won't carry it anyway." The words settled between them. Tessa turned back to Caleb, her eyes searching again. "You don't have to be him." Caleb's expression didn't shift. "I'm not." "Then prove it," she said. "Walk away." Caleb held her gaze. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Koda shifted then, stepping away from Caleb for the first time since they had arrived. Not far, just enough to break alignment. He moved toward the edge of the clearing, stopping where the snow met the darker ground beneath. He stood there, looking out into the trees. Then he turned back, not calling, not signaling, just looking. Caleb followed that gaze. Something in it settled. Not a command, not instinct. Recognition. Caleb exhaled slowly. "I'm not walking away," he said. Tessa's shoulders tightened, then lowered, as if something inside her had reached its limit and stopped resisting. She didn't argue again. She didn't push. She just nodded once. "Then I'm not leaving either," she said. The statement didn't sound like support. It sounded like acceptance. Grant watched the exchange without interruption. Then he shifted his weight, stepping back slightly, giving the space room to hold what had just been decided. "Then you're both going to see it," he said quietly. Tessa glanced at him. "See what?" Grant's gaze moved toward the house, then beyond it, toward something not visible from where they stood. Why he stayed. No one answered. The clearing held its silence, and this time, it didn't feel like waiting. Morning came with a subtle shift rather than a clear arrival. The sky above the mountain had thinned overnight, the heavy gray breaking into softer layers that allowed a colder, sharper light to filter through. Snow no longer fell, and the ground beneath it began to show in patches, dark earth pressing upward through the white, uneven, unhurried. The air still held its bite, but something in it had loosened. Not warmth, movement. Caleb Stroud stood near the side of the house, a worn tool in his hand, working at a hinge that had begun to drag under the weight of the door. The motion was simple, repetitive, controlled. He didn't rush it. He didn't try to perfect it. Just enough pressure, just enough adjustment to make it work again. Koda moved across the clearing in a slow arc, not pacing, not guarding. His steps were lighter now, his attention still precise but no longer fixed in a single direction. He paused occasionally, lifting his head, listening, then moving again. The space had begun to register to him as something more than unfamiliar terrain. It had shape now, boundaries. Tessa stood near the edge of the clearing, her coat pulled tighter around her, watching without speaking. She had not tried to leave since the day before. She had not tried to convince Caleb again, either. Her posture had changed in small ways, less resistance, more observation. She wasn't at ease, but she wasn't pushing against it anymore. "You're fixing things," she said finally. Caleb didn't look up, keeping them from getting worse. Tessa nodded faintly, though he couldn't see it. "That's not the same thing." "No," Caleb said, "it's not." The distinction didn't need explaining. Behind them, the sound of boots approaching across the snow broke the quiet. Measured, familiar. Grant Holloway stepped into the clearing from the same direction he had come before, his denim jacket catching the light differently now that the sky had opened slightly. His posture remained unchanged, steady, contained, carrying something that didn't need to be displayed. "You're settling in," he said. Caleb finished the adjustment on the hinge, testing the door once before stepping back. "Not settling," he replied. "Staying." Grant gave a small nod, as if the difference mattered. "That's how it starts." Tessa turned slightly toward him. "You keep saying that like you've seen it before." Grant's gaze shifted to her. "I have." A pause followed. Not tense, just present. Tessa stepped forward a fraction, her tone more direct now. "Then say it clearly. What is this place?" Grant didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved briefly across the clearing, the house, the line of trees beyond it. When he spoke, his voice carried less distance than before. "It's not what people think it is when they first find it," he said, "and it's not what they try to turn it into after." Caleb leaned lightly against the side of the house, arms folding loosely. "Then what is it?" Grant met his gaze. "It's a place where you don't have to prove anything." The words landed quietly. Tessa frowned slightly. "That doesn't mean anything." "It does," Grant said, not raising his voice. "You just don't like what it implies." Tessa held his gaze but didn't respond. From the edge of the clearing, a new sound emerged, lighter, uneven, accompanied by the crunch of snow that had not yet hardened. All three turned. A man approached along the narrow path. He was older, late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a heavier build that had softened over time but still carried the remnants of strength beneath it. His coat was thick, worn at the seams, his hat pulled low against the cold. His face was broad, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, the kind of lines that came from holding things in rather than letting them out. His name was Harris Doyle. He didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. He stepped into it, slowly, as if confirming the ground would hold him. Grant nodded once in acknowledgement. "Didn't expect you this soon." Harris gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had carried more sound. "Didn't expect to come," he said. His voice was rough, worn, not from age alone. "But I heard." Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard what?" Harris looked at him directly for the first time. His gaze didn't search. It settled. "That someone found it," he said. "That it didn't stay empty." Tessa shifted slightly beside Caleb, her presence tightening again, but not stepping forward. Harris's eyes moved to her briefly, then to Koda, who had approached without being noticed, his posture calm but attentive. Harris studied the dog for a second longer than necessary. "Good dog," he said quietly. Koda didn't react. Harris nodded faintly, as if that confirmed something. Grant stepped slightly to the side, giving space without signaling anything directly. "He went down," he said to Harris, nodding toward Caleb. Harris's expression didn't change, but something in his posture adjusted, a subtle shift of weight. "Then he knows enough," he said. Caleb spoke. "Not enough." Harris met his gaze again. "You won't," he said. "That's the point." The words didn't carry dismissal. They carried certainty. Caleb didn't respond. Harris moved further into the clearing, his steps slower now, deliberate. He stopped near the center, not too close to anyone,
not far enough to disengage. "We didn't come here to fix anything," he said, more to the space than to any one person. "We came because there wasn't anywhere else to put it." Tessa's voice cut in, quieter but firm. "Put what?" Harris glanced at her. "What stays," he said, "when everything else moves on." The answer didn't clarify. It deepened. Caleb looked toward the house, then back at Harris. "He built this for that." Harris nodded once. "Yeah." Grant spoke again, his tone lower now. "Didn't call it anything. Didn't try to." A pause.
Just made sure it stayed. Tessa looked between them, something in her expression shifting again. Not agreement, not understanding, something closer to acceptance of not knowing. "And people come here," she said. Harris let out a slow breath. "Some do." "Why?" Grant answered this time. "Because they don't have to explain why they're here." The clearing fell quiet again. Koda moved then, stepping past Caleb and stopping near Harris. Not close enough to touch, close enough to acknowledge. His head tilted slightly, his gaze steady. Harris looked down at him, his expression unchanged but softer at the edges. "You get it," he said quietly. Koda didn't move. Caleb watched the exchange, then looked back at the house. The structure hadn't changed. It hadn't grown. It hadn't revealed anything new. But the way it existed in the space had shifted. It was no longer something hidden. It was something held. Caleb straightened slightly, pushing off from the wall. "Then it stays," he said. Grant's eyes moved to him, measuring, then settling. "That's not something you decide once." Caleb met his gaze. "I know." Harris nodded faintly, as if that answer mattered more than the decision itself. Tessa exhaled quietly, her shoulders lowering just enough to release something she had been holding since she arrived. She didn't argue. She didn't question. She just stood there. Koda stepped back, returning to Caleb's side. His posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been before. The mountain remained unchanged, but the clearing had shifted. Not built, not defined, recognized. Winter did not end all at once. It loosened. Day by day, the snow thinned across the clearing, retreating in uneven patches that revealed the darker ground beneath. The sky above the mountain no longer held its flat, unmoving gray. It shifted now, pale blue breaking through in narrow openings, light reaching farther across the trees. The air remained cold, but it carried something different. Space, distance, the sense that time was moving again. Caleb Stroud stood at the edge of the clearing, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his red and black flannel jacket, his gaze fixed on the line where the forest met the open ground. The house behind him had not changed in any obvious way. It was still the same structure built into the slope, the same dark timber, the same quiet presence. But the way it existed in the space had shifted. It was no longer waiting. It was holding. Koda moved across the clearing in a wide arc, his stride longer now, freer. He ran without urgency, cutting through the remaining snow, then slowing as he reached the far edge, turning back toward Caleb. His coat caught the light differently in the open air, the darker tones sharper against the thinning white. He stood there for a moment, watching, not calling, not signaling, just present. Caleb held that gaze briefly, then looked away. Behind him, footsteps approached, not cautious, not hesitant, measured. Tessa stepped up beside him, her coat lighter than it had been when she first arrived, her posture less rigid. Her blonde hair was no longer pulled tight, strands moving slightly with the breeze. She had changed in ways that were not immediately visible, not softer, not harder, more settled. "They're coming again," she said. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." Tessa glanced toward the path leading into the trees. Two this time. Caleb followed her gaze. Two figures moved through the thinning forest, their shapes clearer as they approached the clearing. One of them was Grant Holloway, his pace unchanged, steady as always. The other man walked slightly behind him, his posture more reserved, his movements careful but not uncertain. As they stepped into the open, the second man became clearer. He was younger than Grant, early 40s, tall but narrow in frame, his shoulders slightly drawn inward, as if accustomed to holding himself smaller than he was. His hair was dark, cut short, his face carrying the kind of tension that didn't come from fear, but from long-held restraint. His name was Evan Brooks. He stopped just inside the clearing, his eyes moving over the space, not searching, not assessing. recognizing something he had not yet decided to name. Grant nodded once toward Caleb. "Told you I'd be back." Caleb returned the nod. "You did." Grant gestured slightly toward the man beside him. "This is Evan." Evan gave a brief acknowledgement, not quite a nod, not quite a greeting. His voice, when he spoke, was low, controlled. "I wasn't sure this place was real." Tessa glanced at him, then at Grant. "And now?" Evan's eyes moved across the clearing again, then settled briefly on the house. "I'm still not," he said. Grant let out a faint breath that might have been agreement. "That doesn't change anything." Evan didn't respond. Koda moved then, approaching them at an even pace. He didn't circle, he didn't test. He stopped a few feet away, his posture neutral, his gaze steady. Evan looked down at the dog, something in his expression shifting slightly, not easing but loosening. "Good dog," Evan said quietly. Koda didn't react. He didn't need to. Caleb stepped forward a fraction, closing the distance without crossing into it. "You staying?" he asked. Evan hesitated, the motion subtle but visible. His eyes shifted once toward the tree line behind him, then back to the clearing. "I don't know," he said. Grant answered for him, not over him. "He might." Caleb nodded once. "That's enough." The words settled simply, no expectation attached. Tessa moved toward the house, pushing the door open without hesitation. The hinge Caleb had adjusted days earlier moved cleanly, without resistance. She stepped inside, leaving the door open behind her. Grant followed a moment later. Evan remained where he was for a second longer, his gaze fixed on the threshold. Then he moved forward, slower but without stopping. Koda turned, walking back toward Caleb, his shoulder brushing lightly against his leg before continuing toward the house. Caleb followed. Inside, the air felt warmer than the mountain outside, though no heat source had changed. The space remained sparse: table, chairs, bed. No additions, no attempts to make it something else. Tessa had already moved to the center of the room, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Grant stood near the wall, his posture relaxed but attentive. Evan stopped just inside the doorway, not stepping further in yet. Caleb crossed the room and set the folded map on the table. He didn't open it. Grant's eyes dropped briefly to it, then back up. "You didn't use it again?" "No," Caleb said. Grant nodded faintly. "You don't need to anymore." Tessa glanced between them. "You keep talking like this place explains itself." Grant looked at her. "It does, just not the way you want." Tessa exhaled slowly, not arguing. Evan finally stepped forward, moving deeper into the room. His gaze shifted across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He wasn't looking for something hidden. He was looking for something that would tell him he was wrong. He didn't find it. "What happens here?" he asked. Caleb answered, "Nothing." Evan frowned slightly. "That's not an answer." "It is," Caleb said. "You don't have to do anything. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to be anything different than what you are when you walk in." Evan's expression didn't soften, but it stopped resisting. Grant spoke quietly. "That's why it works." Tessa leaned back slightly against the table, her arms folding loosely. "And it keeps working." Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. Outside, the wind moved again, carrying the last traces of winter through the trees. The sound reached the house, then passed. Koda moved to the doorway, sitting just inside, his gaze outward. Not guarding, not waiting. Present. Evan stepped closer to the center of the room, his shoulders lowering by a fraction. "And people just stay," he said. "Some do," Grant replied. "And the rest," Caleb answered. "They leave when they're ready." Evan nodded once, slowly. Silence followed. Not empty. Held. Caleb stepped back toward the doorway, his eyes moving across the clearing beyond it. The snow had nearly melted now, leaving uneven ground exposed beneath it. The edges of the space felt clearer, more defined. Koda stood, stepping out into the open again. He ran this time, not fast, not urgent. Free. Caleb watched him for a moment, then stepped out as well. The cold air met him again, but it didn't settle the same way it had before. It moved through him, then passed. Behind him, voices remained low, contained, not demanding attention. He didn't turn back immediately. He didn't need to. For a long time, Caleb had moved forward without knowing where he was going. Now, he wasn't moving at all. And for the first time, that didn't feel like being stuck. It felt like being in place.
This story reminds us that not every truth comes to fix the past. Some truths come to guide us toward who we are meant to become. Caleb did not find a perfect answer about his father, but he found something greater. He found purpose and a place where broken pieces could still belong. And maybe that is how God works in our lives. Not always by removing the pain, but by leading us through it, quietly, patiently, until we discover something stronger inside ourselves. In our daily lives, we all carry things we do not fully understand. Questions, regrets, moments we wish had gone differently. But God does not waste any part of our journey. Even the silence, even the confusion, can become the path that leads us to peace if we are willing to keep walking. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need it. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe that God is guiding your path, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this, and may God bless you, protect you, and bring peace into your life today and always.